The purpose of this video is to explain how to find the area of any triangle, not just a right triangle like you learned in geometry. So in geometry you learn the equation 1/2 base times height, and this can be misleading in trigonometry because you don't always have a right triangle. In fact, you would rarely have a right triangle. So the reason that's so important is this b here in a trigonometry equation looks like it's saying side b, but it means base from what it did in trigonometry. In the second part of this equation here, we have something that they denote as c sine theta. Now, c sine theta can be very confusing as well, so let's take a look at it in a triangle. So if I come over here to this triangle and I drop this altitude, the first thing it does is it identifies the base. Bases are identified by the altitude intersecting them. And that forms a triangle here that is inside of the triangle I'm trying to actually find the area for. What that does is it gives me an angle in the lower left corner that would then allow me to find the altitude or opposite of that and the hypotenuse of the interior triangle. So I set up the equation for sine, which is opposite over hypotenuse. In this case it would be sine is altitude over hypotenuse. I solve by multiplying by hypotenuse on both sides algebraically, and I get the equation altitude is hypotenuse sine. So this c over here is better described as hypotenuse. Okay, so let's take a look at an example. So the example I have here, I have a triangle and I've already identified the altitude. So the altitude that I drew is the one right here, and that identifies this as the base. So if this is my base, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and boom, base 10. So I have to do a little work now to find the altitude. So the altitude, looking at what I have in this triangle, I have a triangle right here, and that triangle has an angle that is 40 degrees. And across from 40, I have the altitude. And then the hypotenuse of this is 5. So if I set up a sine ratio from just SOHCAHTOA trig, sine of 40 is opposite over hypotenuse, which would be altitude over hypotenuse. If I multiply both equations by 5, both sides of the equation by 5, I get that the altitude is 5 sine 40. So I can then put that in the equation for the altitude or height. So then if I look down, all I have to do is just type that into the calculator, make sure it's in degree mode, and you end up getting 16.096. Please note that I did inches squared here because in the problem it says inches multiple times in the problem. Alright, so if I look at that same problem and I take a look at a different side of the triangle, so let's say I were to identify the altitude here, what ends up happening is this altitude on this side, what it does is it creates a situation that will actually give me the same answer. So showing you what's going on here is I have a triangle now that is here. Okay, so if that's my triangle, then my base is now 5. So I went ahead and put 5 in for my base. And looking at the situation, I now have 40 having an opposite now of still the altitude, but now the hypotenuse is now 10. Hypotenuse from this right triangle right here. So again, my equation will still be a sine. It will always be sine to find altitude. So sine of 40 degrees is altitude over 10. Solving that by multiplying by 10 on both sides, I get the altitude is 10 sine 40. And if I put that in the equation and type it in the calculator, I get the exact same answer here that I got over here, which is really interesting. All right, let's take a look at a different triangle altogether. So let's say I had this triangle, and I've already set up two different situations. I'll do the green one first. And I've identified the altitude on this one to be here, okay, making my triangle this small sliver right here. So again, the 82, opposite of 82 is the altitude and the 8. The base of this triangle is 10, so base is 10. Again, I'm going to come over here and find the altitude. So the height or altitude of using sine of 82 would be opposite over hypotenuse, which would be altitude over 8, 8 being this one. So then I would come back and I would multiply both sides by 8, getting 8 sine 82, and then once I find that, I can put that in the equation, and you can see that I just type it in and I get 39.107. The question is, what would the units be? In this case, it would be feet squared. So watch what happens if I do the exact same problem and then I just dial it back here and I decide to look at a base that is the 8 foot. So if my base is up here now, my triangle, here's my altitude, right? I've identified my base as 8 by drawing an altitude to it. However, my triangle is now this triangle. So when I look at that, I would have 82 altitude over 10. I did that problem down here, so I'll take a look at it. Right? So 82 would be opposite over hypotenuse, which would be altitude over 10, as I just mentioned. So what would the altitude be? Multiply both sides by 10, and this question mark would become 10 sine 82. So if I put that in the equation and solve it, I again get the exact same measurement, 39.61 feet squared, that I got earlier with the same problem. Hope you've enjoyed this video about how to find area.